who's joining in, and this is the 7th talk in the Medical Humanities Colloquy that we have been conducting in IIT Gandhinagar, organized by the Humanities and Social Sciences. And we've had a diverse set of conversations on this intersectional, interdisciplinary cluster of medical humanities, though we have focused perhaps a little bit more on literature than other interdisciplinary entanglements of medicine and humanities. Of course, the conversation is wider than medical humanities and literature. And, we've had discussions from various speakers from various geopolitical contexts, from South Africa to Greece to India in this particular talk. And we've had conversations about various cultural formations around medicine, starting from narrative medicine to questions of medical ethics and the various cultural formations that work around the technical sphere of medicine. And over the years, of course, as we know, the field has opened up into a more, let's say a synthetic, but also mutually informative set of conversations between medicine and humanities. Without furthering this conversation, I'm really happy to have Dr. Mahitosh Mandal here. I've known him for a number of years. He's a friend, and it's great to have him here in this colloquy. And he will be talking about something that I think would be very interesting to maybe all of us, if we could think together about these questions, social questions, political questions at one level, questions of mental health. But again, it's also a question of how we approach mental health and to what extent do we medicalize it. Maybe that question is again perhaps part of the things that Mahitosh would have to say to us. So without further ado, let me invite Swati Joshi, who is a PhD student in the department, and she has been a co-organizer and she's worked very hard for this entire seminar series. So Swati, it's up to you now to introduce our speaker, and then over to Mahitosh. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Mahitosh Mandal, welcome first of all. And Dr. Mahitosh Mandal is the chair at the Department of English, Presidency University, Kolkata. His research interests include caste and psychoanalysis. His research papers have been published and are forthcoming in journals such as Lacunae, International Journal for Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Caste, a global journal on social exclusion, and Interdisciplinary Literary Studies, a journal for criticism and theory. His first book, Jacques Lacan, From Clinic to Culture, was published by Orient BlackSwan in 2018. Currently, his monograph on the autoethnography of the Poundras, a Dalit community from West Bengal, is under contract with Navayana. His monograph on a psychoanalytic study of the British novelist John Fowles is under contract with Routledge, and his co-edited volume on the Holocaust and Popular Culture is in the press and is soon to be published by Routledge. He has delivered about 40 invited talks and conference presentations at national and international levels. In 2021, he won the Navayana Dalit History Fellowship for his project on casteism in Bengal and the Global Global Engagements Funds of the University College London for his project on anti-casteism in higher education. A Dalit activist based in West Bengal who dreams of a casteless society. Dr. Mandal is the founder and chief editor of All About Ambedkar, a journal on theory and praxis. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Swati, for the introduction. And thank you, Orkula, for actually inviting me to give this talk, because this is an honor. I have been working on psychoanalysis and caste for some time under the guidance of Professor Meena Dhanda, who is a professor of cultural politics, philosophy and cultural politics at the University of Wolverhampton, Kingdom. And it is over the months that the kind of discussion that unfolded in terms of the interaction I had with her that I thought that it could be an idea, that could be an interesting approach to kind of pathologize casteism, because casteism, or caste for that matter, has been understood at multiple levels. And I am not the first person, of course, to discuss this question of caste and pathology, or caste and psychology, to be more precise. I'll talk about that in a short while. But thank you very much to actually invite me, that you have invited me here for this talk. And this is the first talk I'm actually delivering on this topic. I've been working on it for some time now, but didn't really have the occasion or not the opportunity to actually deliver or even write. So this is going to be a discussion which should initiate, to be more precise, a possibility of theorizing caste in terms of psychopathology. So I don't claim to be offering something exhaustive, comprehensive, or closed for the matter, but I'm trying to open up a possibility of discussion, perhaps from a kind of framework that I have in mind. So the first point that needs to be highlighted outright, and I do every time I talk about caste, is the question of caste atrocities in India. And the fact that these atrocities are on the rise. This is a point that needs to be highlighted repeatedly. Let me share some data, and that would make it clear. Even though apparently caste is a thing of the past, but in the last 15 years or so, last 10 years, let me give you some data from last 10 years, it would show that caste atrocities are severely on the rise. As of 2020, every 10 minutes, a crime is committed against a Dalit, and every day, 8 Dalit women are subjected to rape. This is pretty much a data available on the internet. But what this data doesn't tell us is that in 2010, if you consider the data of 2010 and 2015, you would find that there is a kind of rise that is unbelievable. So in 2010, you had every 80 minutes, there was a crime committed against a Dalit in this country. In 2015, it was like every 15 minutes, a crime was committed against a Dalit. And in 2020, every 10 minutes, committed against a Dalit. So there is a rise. In 2010, there was like 4 Dalit women were raped every day, subjected to sexual abuse and rape. In 2015, the number increased to 6. And in 2020, the number has increased to 8. So 4, 6, 8. So I'm just mentioning this data to emphasize the fact that violence against the Dalits is on the rise. And this is a matter of serious concern, even though media is silent about it, even though mainstream newspapers, mainstream news channels, prime time shows do not highlight these data. It is important to take note of this. And this is something that even Anand Teltumbre has defined as India's hidden apartheid. The apartheid is taking place, violence is taking place, murder, massacre, lynching, sexual abuse, economic exploitation, social ostracization, all these kinds of crimes are repeatedly taking place every day. And still, there is not enough discourse, neither academic nor public discourse about it. The media, the other kinds of platform where this could be showcased, this could be discussed, are totally silent. So the question, even though apparently, as Karl Marx predicted in 1853 in his most, I think, oft-quoted essay, British Rule in India, Marx mentioned that capitalist modernity would eventually bring an end to caste. So you'll have industrialization, you'll have the railways, you'd have technology, you'd have capital, money, etc., etc. It would replace the feudal kind of mindset that is something that apparently informs the idea of caste or casteism for that matter. However, we have found that even capitalist modernity couldn't bring an end to it. The data tells us that Marx was probably wrong. And if you think about the Constitution of India, this is a point that is repeated in Anand Teltumbre's masterpiece, Persistence of Caste. Teltumde also points out the fact that, that even the laws adopted against untouchability or for the abolition of untouchability, even the different kinds of acts, including the Prevention of Atrocities Acts, in spite of these laws being in place, caste atrocities haven't come to an end. This is on the rise. Caste atrocities are on the rise. So this is a point that somehow shows, and even other kind of neoliberalism, globalization, even the series of anti-caste movements, counter-hegemonic struggles, everything has happened, as it were, and still caste persists. The fundamental question that needs to be addressed at the outset is, why does caste persist? Why is it that caste atrocities cannot be brought to an end? Why is it that caste, as Baba Saheb Ambedkar wanted, why is it that caste cannot be annihilated? So what could explain the failure of, one could say, of the project of reformation or annihilation of caste? And this question has been answered predominantly, as all of us know, from a social perspective, from a socio-political, socio-economic perspective. So caste has fundamentally been understood as a social problem. However, in this talk, I want to discuss a possibility of addressing caste as a medical problem. And I think that it is possible, particularly in the context of medical humanities lecture series, it is important. But also in general, I think we need to reformulate the problem of caste in order to the question that why have the caste atrocities not come to an end, or why does caste persist? This question needs to be relocated, I claim, from a social context to a medical context, even to a clinical context. And this is the consideration of caste as a medical problem is something that has already been done to some extent, but of course not that exhaustively. For example, caste has been understood in terms of medical metaphors. Kancha Ilaiah, in a lecture a couple of years back, I think 4 years back, he delivered in Kolkata, there he compared caste to cancer. He said that caste is a cancer without diagnosis. The idea that there is a disease, we know that, but we cannot really diagnose the exact problem, therefore we cannot devise the exact medicine to address the problem of caste. Another journalist from Tamil Nadu, she defined caste as a virus. And in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, she claimed that the virus of caste is more dangerous than coronavirus, precisely because coronavirus does not discriminate. Anybody and everybody can be infected by COVID-19 and can suffer and even can die. So there is no so coronavirus is kind of an equalizer, so to say, like death, as philosophers say, is an equalizer. But the virus of caste, she claims, is not an equalizer. The virus of caste is based on the foundation of discrimination. Some people have to be excluded, some people have to be ostracized, some people have to be murdered so that some others can survive, some others can rule supreme, can dominate. So the entire foundation of Brahminical patriarchy, Brahminical supremacy for that matter, is somewhere related to carrying forward the virus of caste. And society, for that matter, is contaminated by the caste virus. There is, of course, there are other kind of, there is an immensely important work in my understanding produced by Chandrabhan Prasad, who wrote this, classic work, in my understanding, a masterpiece called Dalit Phobia, Why Do They Hate Us? And there, Chandrabhan Prasad, who doesn't really focus on psychology, psychoanalysis, clinical psychology, psychiatry, and so on and so forth, because he talks more from the perspective of brain sciences and neurobiological problems and so on and so forth. But one of the things that he suggests is that caste should be considered to be a genetically transmitted disease, And he wants brain experts and medical professionals to look into the problems of the neurobiological problems that might be linked to caste. And this is a fascinating study, although I don't have time to elaborate on that. I have very short time. But I'm just saying that there have been attempts to medicalize the question of caste. It is not that, this is something that is absurd, or this is something that I'm doing it for the first time. It's not like that. There is a tradition within which this talk needs to be located. But however, in my understanding, alongside this medicalizing the caste problem, I think what stands out in this discourse of medicalizing the problem of caste is to look at caste more as a psychological phenomenon, more as a psychological problem. Because most of these people use medical terms both more as metaphors, perhaps, than as actual medical disease or problem. But I think this discourse tries to indicate is to look into caste as more of a psychological problem. So what they try to do is to psychologize caste. And therefore, this is not I should mention that psychologizing caste is not something that is implicit in the anti-caste scholarship. This was actually started by Babasaheb Ambedkar in a lecture that he delivered in 1936 in a conference in Marathi, where he actually mentioned caste, described caste as a state of mind, and also even one could say he even described caste as a disease of the mind. And this reference hasn't been highlighted much. And what Babasaheb mentions there is that the entire problem of caste, the entire problem of caste segregation, as he calls it, or caste-based segregation, started because non-Brahmins in the larger Varna system, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, the Shudras, in the larger context of the non-Brahmin classes, Varna as class as opposed to caste, and class is open, caste is closed, and so on and so forth. So it is the Brahmins who started endogamous enclosure. So in order for caste to be born out of the Varna system, it had to be a closed system, a closed class, but it is a closed class, and that closed state could be done in terms of controlling sexuality and marriage. And therefore, this entire concept of endogamous exists, marriage within the caste, marriage within that particular class, that Brahmins would marry only Brahmins. This particular discourse of endogamy was emulated, Babasaheb Ambedkar tells us, was emulated by the non-Brahmins. So there is an attempt, according to Babasaheb's psychological analysis of caste, there is an attempt to imitate or emulate unknowingly people who are superior to us. So Brahmins being superior, and the non-Brahmins, the people who are lower in the Varna grade, they are emulating people who are at the higher level. And Babasaheb, even in the 1917 text, casts their mechanism, genesis, and development, then he also gives a psychological and a mechanistic explanation of the advent of caste system. And the point I'm trying to make is that even though Babasaheb doesn't really refer to depth psychology, or even, it would have been interesting because he was studying in America at that point of time, and he could have definitely come in contact with certain psychological studies of the time. But the point remains that he doesn't refer to, of course, Freud and others, but he does imply the possibility of caste being deeply embedded in the mind. And of course, it is possible to explore further references in Babasaheb Ambedkar, but this talk is not about that. But what I'm saying is that Babasaheb already had indicated the possibility of psychologizing caste. Even perhaps if I take the translation of the Marathi phrase, the translation that I have read, which reads, he defines caste as disease of the mind, then one could also say that he not only psychologized caste, but also perhaps indicates the possibility of pathologizing caste. Cut to 21st century, and we have, like I mentioned, already. I have mentioned Chandrabhan Prasad, but I should perhaps mention the entire concept of Dalit phobia that he develops, even though not as he doesn't really psychologize it outright. But one thinker who has at a great extent, at great length, has tried to psychologize and even psychopathologize caste is the Dalit psychiatrist based in London. His name is Shushrut Jadhav. And Shushrut Jadhav, in many of his interviews and articles, including one article which is called, which goes by the title Caste, Culture and Clinic. And Shushrut Jadhav talks about what he calls psychological ethnocide. He defines casteism as psychological ethnocide. And he, in fact, engages in group therapy to basically bring out the casteist mentality in a given group of, let's say, upper caste persons. So what I'm trying to say is this, and even Chandravan Prasad, he also talks about the possibility of what he calls Dalit therapy. So he says that people who are suffering from Dalit phobia should be offered Dalit therapy, by which he means that they should be brought, let's say, in a hospital where all the doctors and the staff are Dalits, so that they get treated there, and then they eventually get to know everybody is a Dalit. So the fear of the Dalits can be overcome, or perhaps they can associate with the Dalits better. So some very innovative ideas are developed there, in terms of what he calls Dalit therapy. Although the practicality or pragmatism of this could be debated, but these ideas are there, out there. So what I'm trying to say is that there has been an attempt to basically psychologize the casteism, and even to some extent psychopathologize casteism. Today, what I intend to do is basically to focus on the possibility of pathologizing casteism, and quite strongly. And of course, to pathologize caste, and the term that I think would be better suited for the purpose is casteism as opposed to caste, because casteism is like racism. It's a prejudice, it's a belief, it's an internalized kind of belief in the supremacy of the Brahmins and the status of the Dalits as less than humans. So the entire process of dehumanization almost is a product of some kind of internalized beliefs about the Dalits, outcasts, the depressed class, scheduled caste, whatever way we describe them. So I think to use the term casteism could be more appropriate in this context. And I also think that to pathologize casteism, one needs to look at both the perpetrators and the victims, and not just at the victims. And Baba Saheb, in his famous work, Untouchables or the Children of India's Ghetto, he makes a very interesting point that whenever there is a problem related to caste, everybody says there is something wrong with the untouchables. Nobody says that there is something wrong with the caste Hindus. I'm making a similar gesture here in terms of saying, yes, pathologizing caste, but not necessarily for the victims. And not necessarily the fact that victims, like the victim Dalits, are suffering from caste-induced trauma. Of course they are. But I think the more significant point is to point the finger at the perpetrators and to say that they are the patients as well, that they need to be treated as well. They are manifesting pathologies. So psychopathology of casteism, therefore, needs to consider the pathological symptoms, not only manifested by people who are suffering caste, but also people who are perpetrating caste. And also the other point I want to make is, before I actually get into the specific pathological examples of pathology, I would also be, I think psychoanalytic framework is not entirely suited at this point in time to address the question of caste. Of course, and I refer to Frantz Fanon and his famous work, of course, one of his, I think his first work, Black Skin, White Masks. And there, Fanon, as all of us know, he not only uses psychoanalysis, but he also revises psychoanalytic formula. He even rejects some of the findings of psychoanalysis. For example, he says that the pathology of the quote-unquote Negro, of the Black person, cannot be understood in terms of the pathology of the European white subject, because the European white subject, his socialization, his castration, his family complexes, etc., are related to the family that reproduces the military political structure of that white space, so to say. But for the Black subject, it is the encounter with the white world that creates the trauma. And even he refers to the possibility of the black person's family being more matriarchal. And therefore, at one point in Black Skin, White Marks, he says that we are proud of the fact that we, Antilles, the black people, have not produced any Oedipus complex. Now, this is totally debatable and all that. But the kind of critique that Fanon, who uses Lacan, uses Freud frequently in the entire text of Black Skin, White Marks, the kind of critique he offers, I think could be important for anybody trying to psychosocialize, shall I say, psychologize or psychopathologize casteism. And therefore, I think it is not entirely possible to use psychoanalytic framework the way it exists. For example, in my understanding, caste should be considered not only in terms of the individual unconscious, but also in terms of the collective unconscious. And collective unconscious, as all of us know, is a theory developed by Carl Gustav Jung, who had a split with Freud, and then he eventually developed his own school called School of Analytical Psychology, which was different from psychoanalysis. Therefore, to what extent collective unconscious can be considered to be a psychoanalytic concept is debatable, and I don't think it can be considered as such. But the point I'm trying to make is this: it's possible, like Fanon does in Black Skin, White Mask, it's possible to modify collective unconscious as a concept and to try and understand not only racism but also casteism and how it is embedded in the collective unconscious. For example, what Fanon does is that Fanon basically tells us that for Jung, the collective unconscious is something that is transmitted in terms of brain structures, even in terms of genetic structures, and therefore the possibility of the and it is almost instinctual, it is almost biological. So what Fanon says that Jung has failed to distinguish between instinct and habit. He says racism is a product of habit, not instinct. Therefore, collective unconscious should be understood as an imposed culture, as an imposed cultural prejudice, as opposed to a natural instinctual prejudice. So collective unconscious, if it is understood in terms of brain sciences, like to some extent what Chandra Prasad does, although he doesn't refer to Jung, I think it is important to look into the possibility of the repressed, the reservoir of the repressed, which not only affects the individual as he grows up in the family, but also by virtue of being born within the Hindu society, there is such an interpellation of the subject by the collective unconscious, collective Brahminical unconscious, if I can define it like this. So I find that collective unconscious could be used. It could even be adopted within the psychoanalytic framework to make sense of the problem of casteism. Somewhat similar to what Fanon does. And of course, I should mention, I don't have time for that, the kind of analysis of racism that Fanon does in terms of using psychoanalysis or clinical psychology, even psychiatry, is not entirely tenable in the context of casteism, but that's a different discourse altogether. The other thing I think that needs to be mentioned is that when we think about casteism in terms of pathology, we need to think about casteist behaviors, casteist acts as symptoms. It help us not only terminologically, but also perhaps thematically to analyze the problem of caste. So what if we look at the casteist acts like, let's say, lynching or gang rape or mob lynching of a Dalit man, gang rape of a Dalit woman, it's happening rampantly almost every week. Not every incident is reported and so on. What if we could think about these in terms of calling them symptoms? For example, Fanon thinks about lynching the black person as a manifestation of sexual revenge. So the black person is of course considered to be sexually more potent, and the white man therefore experiences sexual jealousy because he's not potent enough, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the lynching the black person, according to Fanon, contributes or rather manifests or helps taking sexual revenge, for that matter. So what if we could also think about lynching in those terms? I want to develop that in course of the lecture, but I'm just saying that the parallels are really interesting and really productive for the matter. But however, I think it is also possible to talk about casteism as asymptomatic. So we think about symptomatic casteism, somebody making a casteist remark or engaging in a casteist act, or even engaging in violence, caste-based violence. But there could also be, if we consider collective unconscious to be something that can be used to understand casteism, I think there could be something called asymptomatic.
Is it just me, or is he frozen for others too? Sorry, I think Mahitosh, maybe I don't know whether it's a problem on my end, but maybe you got frozen for like 45 seconds or something.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that the casteism could be defined both as symptomatic and asymptomatic. So people could potentially be casteist. Everybody is potentially a casteist in that sense. It's just that moment hasn't arrived. It's just that encounter hasn't happened. It's just that and it happens at multiple levels. And I will give some examples later on. So these are some of the as it were points of reference, some of the avenues, some of the directions along which we could think about the possibility of pathologizing casteism. Now, let me quickly refer to the title of the talk, Psychopathology of Everyday Casteism. Of course, it's a reference to Freud's 1901 masterpiece, Psychopathology of Everyday Life. And there, of course, Freud doesn't talk about serious pathological problems, but he talks about what could be considered as everyday pathology. And of course, the fundamental formation of the unconscious, as Lacan would call it, that he defines or he discusses is blunder, or what James Tracy has translated or defined as parapraxis. And parapraxis is like slips of the tongue, forgetting, mislaying an object, bungled actions. All these, according to Freud, we're trying to remember someone's name, for example, but we can't remember the name. Or the reason could be that that name is associated with a person who, let's say, hypothetically caused trauma to the subject. Therefore, because nobody wants to revisit that trauma, it could trigger a lot of things. It could affect the subject in the present. Therefore, the act of forgetting happens because it could help us avoid such an uncomfortable experience being repeated or revived, for that matter, resurfacing and so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to make is this, that for Freud, every unforced error, as Shantanu Biswas pointed out once, every unforced error is unconsciously motivated. So be it a slip of the tongue, be it forgetting, be it mislaying an object, and so on and so forth. Every such action, every such act is linked to a repressed content, which could be linked to some trauma. And this is more or less what Freud says. This happens. These things happen. These experiences, these slips of the tongue, these examples, can be experienced on a daily basis. But when I say psychopathology of everyday casteism, I don't refer to something that is somewhat harmless. Forgetting a name or making a slip of the tongue would be embarrassing sometimes, but it might not necessarily be harmful. But when I say everyday casteism, the phrase that makes all the difference from what Freud has developed, in the sense that everyday casteism is a very serious matter. Casteism is an everyday affair, and it manifests itself in terms of symptoms, which are, if you allow me to call them symptoms, which are grave, which have far-reaching consequences, which causes death, for that matter. So therefore, psychopathology of everyday casteism, even though it's an allusion to the title of Freud's text, it is not trying to theorize something that happens on a day-to-day basis and somewhat harmless. It is extremely serious business that I'm trying to theorize in this context. And of course, to take from there, for Freud talks about 4 kinds of formations of the unconscious, as all of us know. One is, of course, dream. It would be interesting to analyze the dream of a Dalit subject within the clinical context, but I'm not getting into that. Even for example, the a Brahmin subject for the matter. But I think other formations of the unconscious that Freud talks about, for example, parapraxis, forgetting someone's name, this could be brought within the context of a pathology of casteism. I'll talk about that. We could also think about jokes, Freud's joke book, jokes and the relation to the unconscious. And we know that social media and our entire life is filled with casteist jokes. Everywhere there are casteist jokes. So one could probably talk about the possibility of jokes, casteist jokes, and the relation to the Brahminical unconscious in the fashion in which Freud analyzes jokes. We could also talk about symptoms, as Freud calls them, symptoms of different kinds, symptoms of neurosis, symptoms of perversion in particular, sadism and masochism, paranoia, etc., phobia. These categories and subcategories and symptoms associated with them, this could also be talked about in the context of psychopathology of caste. These are just some markers I'm just putting forward. However, given the time, I would very quickly try and delve into some of the possible pathologies that we could, with examples perhaps, that we could define as pathology of caste or caste-induced pathologies, one could say. The first is casteism in the collective unconscious. I have already referred to the theoretical part of it. What could it mean to say that casteism is embedded in the collective unconscious? I'll give two examples. One example is from my own experience. I know a senior of mine who's very tall and fair and handsome, and he happens to be a Dalit. So he went to the house of a Brahmin, and there the lady, the Brahmin lady, told him, "You are a scheduled caste, but you don't look like one. You are saying you are a Dalit, but you don't look like one." Very interesting question, a very interesting observation. So what does a Dalit look like? There must be an image, an archetype of the Dalit in the collective unconscious of the Hindus. And this exact situation was reproduced in a recently released short film called The Discreet Charm of the Shavarnas. And those of you who have watched it, you would know that in this film, which is basically, allusion to the film by Buñuel, Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, and here the director and actors, a director and a group of actors, they're looking for an actor who would play the role of a Dalit. Now they're looking for an actor, but they can't find, because every time they find an actor, he doesn't look like that actor doesn't look like a Dalit. Okay, and then at the end of the film, they end up actually meeting an actual Dalit person, a Dalit girl. And the moment they look at her, the first reaction they have is that, "Oh, you are a Dalit, but you don't look like a Dalit. Like, she's smart, she's beautiful, she can speak English," and so on and so forth. So what is it that, I can give examples after examples, I don't have time, but what I'm saying is that what is it that we mean when we say that someone doesn't look like a Dalit? What does a Dalit look like? This is where the black person is different from the problem of the Dalit person. Fanon says that the black person's entire dehumanization happens just because of the skin color, just because of the biological reasons, just because of the fact that his entire being is reduced to his anatomy, his sexual potency, his monstrosity, quote unquote, because he is black, and so on and so forth. But the reduction of the Dalit, the dehumanization of the Dalit happens, but we don't know why and how. Why, of course, perhaps we know, but why, in what way, we don't know. The Dalit can be fair and dark. The Dalit can be short and tall, ugly and handsome, beautiful and I don't know, and so on and so forth. But what I'm trying to say is this: therefore, you have an image, but it's not an image, it's an idea. The idea of the Dalit in the collective unconscious, and that idea, perhaps in my understanding, a Dalit is somebody who is perhaps understood as poor. So if you are wearing, if you are behaving like a rich person with rich clothes and attire and wristwatch and etc., and traveling by car, you cannot be a Dalit. ugly, you have to be ugly. You can't be handsome. And then of course you have to be dark skin, perhaps. Perhaps you have to be dirty, and you have to be dumb. And of course, mythologically, you have to be a dashu, a monster. So we don't know. You ask the person, you are saying he doesn't look like a Dalit, then what does a Dalit look like? I'm sure that person will not have an answer. He will not, or at least not an immediate answer. And the fact that he will not have an immediate answer is because the idea of caste, the idea of a Dalit, is embedded in the collective unconscious. It is inherited in such a manner that you subscribe to this belief, but you don't actually have any reason to subscribe to it. You don't have an explanation for it. I'm running out of time, so very quickly, maybe two more examples. One would be what I'm trying to define as the formation of the Brahminized subject, in the fashion in which Lacan talks about formation of the subject in his essay on the family complexes, and also taking cue from Fanon. I think it would be interesting to think about something called Dalit by birth, but wearing a Brahminical mask. Dalit by birth, but wearing a Brahminical mask. By which I basically mean that the very formation of the subject within the caste Hindu society is fundamentally a Brahminical formation. So I can give examples from my own life, like when I was in my village, and from our childhood, we were asked to worship all the Hindu gods and Hindu goddesses, and eventually the people who became the heroes of our life were inevitably from among the Brahmins and the upper castes. For example, this entire myth that, it is debatable, but the idea that the entire myth of Durga, goddess Durga, is also an attempt to justify the violence against the tribals, Ashur being a tribal hero in certain contexts, although it is debatable. I'm just giving one example here to say that the way the childhood of a Hindu subject takes place, as it were, or develops, is fundamentally you learn to appreciate certain people who hail from within a Brahminical intellectual tradition, or heroes who are fundamentally Brahmins. For example, the history textbooks in school life, they talk about the Bengal Renaissance, glorify Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar in the context of Bengal, Ram Mohan Rai and others. But there is a gap in terms of the Dalit resistance that took place in colonial Bengal. For example, Guru Chand Thakur, who established hundreds of schools, and many others from colonial times, who are never mentioned. At least when I grew up, I didn't find their names mentioned. So what I'm trying to say is that the entire culture, the way it shapes us, the entire discourse is Brahminical, and therefore eventually we start thinking, Dalits start thinking like the Brahmins and aspire to be like the Brahmins. And therefore there develops a hatred of the for other Dalits who are trying to assert. So I remember when I was starting to write an article, one of the responses was that, okay, because of people like you who are always talking about caste, we who are also from the similar caste, we suffer. You talk about caste, you talk about justification of reservation, and we suffer. I have also seen like certain OBCs being particularly hating Dalits and even tribals and associating more with the Brahmins. I've seen Dalits hating tribals. So this is a graded hatred, as it were, which is fundamentally Brahminical. And this is instilled within us in the unconscious. But I don't have time to develop it further, but I'm sure I've tried to make some sense. Very quickly, 2-3 more points. I think a third way to psychopathologize caste would be to think about psychopathology of what I could call invisibilizing the caste, invisibilizing the Dalit. So in a classroom situation, there are Dalit students, and the teacher is addressing everyone except them. It has happened in a newsroom. you have Dalits, very few in number, and they are, and the Dalit issues are never even made part of the news streaming. So what I'm trying to say is that there, and even I remember one person once told me, you know this person Kancha Ilaiah, he's absurd. What he writes, nobody should read. And I remember that I was told that I should be reading Spivak and not Kancha Ilaiah. And this is hilarious kinds of things that happened. And when you discover Kancha Ilaiah as a thinker, you realize that how casteist the academia happens to be. The other things, I'll very quickly end by making one remark about atrocities. Atrocities are on the rise. I began by saying that. But I think atrocities are signs of the advancement of the Dalits. Atrocities are happening because Dalits are coming at par with the upper castes. And this is why the upper castes are feeling threatened. So it has to be psychologized as well. The fact that you feel threatened, therefore you feel insecure. And every time there is unemployment, there is somebody not getting a job, the blame is automatically on the person who. It is never understood that reserved jobs are different in terms of number, in terms of categorization from the jobs that are open. So blame automatically is put on the Dalits. So, but at the same time, I think atrocities should be understood as manifestations of phobia, Dalit phobia, something that even Chandrabhan Prasad has tried to develop. And this phobia derives from anxiety. Phobia is a fear which is usually baseless. So instead of calling it fear, I think we should call it phobia. And this phobia derives from an anxiety that is related to the unconscious, perhaps. And the anxiety that the Brahminical supremacy is coming to an end. The anxiety that we might be defeated, we might be dominated, or there could be a dictatorship of the Dalits, for that matter. And this is also what explains, in my understanding, two very severe atrocities: lynching and sexual abuse. Lynching is fundamentally related, in my understanding, to, once again, I mean, the examples of lynching are heterogeneous, but there is a category of lynching which involves lynching the Dalit because the Dalit dared to fall in love with an upper caste girl. I think this is something that connects to the entire discourse that Babasaheb Ambedkar had theorized, the idea that Brahmins must keep their women within their community. Upper caste must keep their women within their community because, and that is why they have, even at the cost of polygamy, even at the cost of girl marriage, even at the cost of the burning of the sati, women of a particular caste group, particularly within a Brahminical group, must not be allowed to have sexual liaison with people from lower caste and never ever from people from the outcast group. So outcasts are they are far so to say removed from that. So the point I'm trying to make is that even lynching could be linked to the unconscious anxiety of the failure to preserve caste purity. And this is something that in most of the cases, lynching is a manifestation of that sexual, of that frustration that our women, quote unquote, our women have been, so to say, and women become the site of this caste violence for that matter. And women become, be it an upper caste woman or a lower caste woman or a Dalit woman, women become the site for the violence, site for the manifestation of the symptom, as I'm trying to say. I remember about sexual abuse of Dalit women, one example where it was said, I think it happened in Rajasthan or Tamil Nadu, I forget the exact place, where it was said that the Dalit women were raped because the Brahmin men wanted to put them in their place, meaning that they have to be they have to be put in their place. It means that you should know you are Dalits, you are out there, we can do whatever we want, and we are the supreme, we dominate you. So the theories of rape, there are many theories of rape, but one of the theories that I find interesting is or even relevant for this context is that it is an assertion of domination, and this domination, this sadistic kind of act, derives from this experience of insecurity. So I would conclude that section and just come to conclusion in terms of saying that atrocities, therefore, are to be understood as something that indicate the advancement of the Dalits and the psychical crisis of the upper castes. Very quickly, like in my understanding, that if we engage, and we could also think about other examples, but we don't have time. Just 1 minute. I think I should conclude by saying that the potential or the contribution to anti-caste scholarship or even anti-caste movement that psychopathology of everyday casteism talk like this or a discourse like this can make. One would be to say that it can help us. It can help us once again to reformulate, as I said, the problem of caste from being a social problem to being a clinical problem. It can also help us to revise the existing psychoanalytic, psychiatric, and psychological frameworks. For example, Shusru Jadhav says that the syllabus of psychiatry in India, it never engages with the question of caste discrimination or caste-based suffering. So I think it is important to revise the discourse of psychology and psychiatry or psychotherapy in general. And it is important to, what Ilaiah calls, if I can use this word, it is important to Dalitize psychiatry. I also think it is important to think about the possibility of free clinic that Freud had once talked about for people like Dalits, most of whom are the poorest of the poor, for them to be able to avail therapy, even though therapy is a stigma and so on and so forth. The other point would be to think about the possibility of group therapy for the upper caste and to bring out the casteist mentality and resolve it, so to say. So therefore, psychopathology of everyday casteism, if we try and locate and explain and develop such a discourse, can actually help us to contribute to the project of annihilation of caste, at least theoretically, in terms of redefining and reformulating the problem of caste. I think I have spoken a lot. I'm very sorry. Thank you very much.
It's perfectly fine. And thank you so much, Mahitosh, for this very rich and far-reaching talk in the sense that, it's almost, there are so many different aspects to your analysis. I don't want to take a lot of time. Just a very general sort of point, which is, of course, beyond what you were saying there. This is not really what you were discussing. But I've generally been quite interested in this idea of an identification without identity that sometimes psychoanalysis, especially in its final frontier, could offer, where there are identifications, but there's also a certain vacuity of the identity discourse that psychoanalysis, at least in the Lacanian orientation, would promote. And I've often seen certain kinds of, at least conceptual connections between that idea of identification without identity and something like an annihilation of caste, which is, again, one of those identity discourses. Again, this is just a general remark. Of course, you may not respond to this. It's entirely up to you. But it'll be great to have questions. I think I've now, enabled the chat box. So if you have questions that you want to put in the chat box, you could do that. Or if you have questions that you want to ask, please feel free to unmute yourself. And we could at least have a Q&A for another 10 minutes. If there are questions, comments, anything that anyone wants to share in response, please go ahead.
Can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So, I am primarily trained in social sciences. And what I wonder is about this issue of the functional role, right? So whenever you talk about power structures in general, and economic organization of any society, most cultural beliefs, values, and so on form sort of like a substratum, right, which ensures that social reproduction is taking place. And the structure of society, in current society, you can talk about capitalism or whatever, is somehow maintained, right? So Gramsci has talked about this, Althusser has talked about it. So you have a frame of violence, which is only being used in exceptional circumstances, when this inherent belief system is sort of breaking down, which you also pointed out that the mobility of Dalits is sort of threatening, and therefore you see this overt use of violence. The same thing I think the state also uses time and time again. So a powerful state is a state where the police don't need guns, right? Where the police don't need to be on the streets. So this sort of an idea, the regimented aspect of it, right? So if you bring in this sort of a perspective, what is the functional role, if I were to ask that question, that caste plays in the psychology, for so to speak, in the mind? So questions such as efficiency, right, in terms of locating people very efficiently within the social fabric, because you inherently have limited number of social resources, or physical resources, emotional resources, and so on. So a diagnostic sort of a coordinate system, if it could be said. So can caste be looked at like that? Like it is providing some sort of a frame for locating people, and that frame is now becoming absolutely irrelevant, right? So you are basically having a relic of the past, right, which was geared towards securing certain resources and ensuring that there is no dilution taking place, that purity of blood and stuff like that comes primarily from this. It's a question also of property. It's a question of power, right? And caste provided this sort of frame, but now suddenly you see that this porousness has increased because of capitalist advancement and state and so on. So is it primarily that this is an older diagnostic system that is now failing, and therefore there is a need for generating new stereotypes, new ways in which we can place individuals more accurately? So what is this role that you would say that caste is now playing in society? And eventually, when you look at it, that role which is supposed to be played, I mean, these questions don't really go away. So in place of caste, do we need another system, or is another system emerging, right, to take over these roles that this sort of a psychological structure performed, right? So is it a possibility of going in that direction? Like, what is the value, right, of it when we look at the functional aspect, right?
May I request you to put your question in just one line? Sorry, it was a discourse, not a question.
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, simply put, it would be that when you speak about caste as a psychopathology, what would you say is going to be the replacement of caste in the functioning of the Indian psyche?
Okay, that's a very precise summarization of your own discourse. Thank you very much. That's a good question, actually. First of all, it's a difficult question. What is going to replace caste? I don't think that much beyond at this point in time. I don't think anything is going to replace caste. The caste-based unconscious or unconscious structure in and by the caste, I think it is going to stay here for some time. So to what extent, even if we pathologize caste, I don't think it is like, if you think about racism for the matter, and pathologize race, or think about racism as a pathological condition, do you think that it is ever going to go away? Racism is never going to go away. I think casteism also is never going to go away. Or at least, that's a very pessimistic way to look at it, but that's how things have been for centuries. We have come up with new ways of coping with it. But I think the other, like from the larger point that you made, I think a caste being something that, as you said, caste is a relic of the past, something like that. I think caste is not a relic of the past. Caste privileges are very much enjoyed even today. So the kind of resources you're talking about, 77% of India's population, I'm quoting Anand Teltumre's Persistence of Caste in this context. 77% of India's population, I think, live below the poverty line as of 2010. Out of which I think around 80% or something, the bulk of the population are Dalits. Yeah, we think about poor who are like upper caste poor, but the bulk of them who live below the poverty line, 88%, if I remember correctly, is living below the poverty line. So resources, what resources? Whose resources? Resources are still in the hands of the upper castes. Think about the billionaires. How many Dalit billionaires do you have, for that matter? So I think it's a good question and difficult question in the sense that I cannot answer it at this point, and it is also something we don't know what is going to happen in the future. But as of now, caste I don't think is a relic of the past. I think it is very much a part of our economic resources, capital, cultural capital, in whatever you describe resource. I think it's very much an experience of the present and not something related to the past. And Indian psyche is going to be structured in terms of past for many, many decades to come. I don't think it is never going to go away. That's exactly why I should mention one point, that caste is becoming a global problem. There are examples of caste atrocity in the UK and in the USA, in the Silicon Valley, in Bab's Temple, in New Jersey, in California, in London. There are instances of caste-based discrimination. The courts in the USA and the UK and other parts of the world where Indian diaspora is there. So Babasaheb Ambedkar at one point mentioned that wherever the Hindus migrate, they will carry caste with them. And caste would become a global problem. The caste is actually becoming a global problem. So I don't think that caste is a past. I think caste is the future, if you like. So we need to deal with it, taking it that seriously. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mahitosh. I'm just going to relay a question from the chat box. Deepak asks, how far can we distance habitual operations of casteism from instinctual faculty of human mind?
That's a very good question. In fact, it relates to something that I discussed and also something that Fanon talks about in Black Skin, White Mask. For Fanon, racism is not anything instinctual. It is habitual. And therefore, he modifies the idea of the collective unconscious by calling it as something that is constituted by habits of generation after generation and not anything instinctual. I also don't think, insofar as casteism is concerned, casteism to be something that is instinctual. I think we could talk about something called a reflex casteism, casual casteism. You have an instant reflex response to a Dalit, to a meme, where Ambedkar is downgraded, to an advertisement, and so on and so forth. But I think that could be considered to be reflex. Reflex is not necessarily instinctual. So insofar as casteism is concerned, I think we could think about, insofar as I'm concerned, think about casteism as more habitual and perhaps reflex, like if you say the reflex response. This is a real life incident. A student of mine who is a Dalit, who is in love with a Brahmin girl, and they were in a relationship for a long time, and her mother got to know about him. And the first moment she told her his name and surname, her immediate reflex was anger and dismissal, and even asking the girl to go away from the house and so on and so forth. So this is reflex. Without the reflex, I don't think it's instinct as such, but it could be interesting to think about caste as a reflex response or habitual operation. Instinctual, I'm not very sure about it. But good question, very good question.
Thank you, Mahitosh. I think Shovik has a point that is basically a response to the first question by Kaustuv. Let me not go into this. Preeti has a question. I'm just reading out the question because she is, of course, she's thanking you for this wonderful talk. And at the end, she says, can you elaborate on what it means to think like Brahmins?
Yeah. I think that the did I use the word think like Brahmins? I don't know. But if I have used it, I don't know, you would have the recording. What I perhaps meant, or what I would mean by thinking like Brahmins, would be to think in a Brahminical manner. So Brahmanism could be considered to be an ideology, which via Althusser could be defined as something that interpellates every Indian subject. And by that logic, everybody is potentially Brahminical. The fact that a Dalit or even a Bahujan person or even an Adivasi person might feel more comfortable being associating with Brahmins or upper castes, reproducing their discourse rather than looking into themselves, or might feel uncomfortable talking about themselves. I think this could be considered to be a Brahminical attitude which cuts across people. So it is more of an ideology, and therefore we have this entire notion of de-Brahminization. So one of the ways that what Kanchai Leja says that we need to Dalitize India, which means that we need to de-Brahminize India. There is a mentality called Brahminism, and that mentality has to be got rid of. So thinking like Brahmins, I think, would mean more like thinking in a Brahminical manner, which means that which subscribes to the discourse of Brahminical supremacy, subscribes to the discourse that Brahmins are Aryans and others are Dalits and tribals are like native people. It's total nonsense. And so this racist, supremacist discourse is what, and belief in this discourse is what makes one think in a Brahminical manner. So I think the more, I think a better, more precise wording would be thinking in a Brahminical manner rather than thinking like a Brahmin. And once again, I mean, things like that. Think about a normal thing like the sacred thread ceremony. The fact that I have seen many Brahmin men, not Brahmin women. Brahmin women do not undergo that ceremony. And Brahmin men, and the kind of they are taught when they are getting the thread. I mean, this is dangerous. And to think that, okay, we are special kind of men, these things are happening all the time, as you understand. So what I'm saying is that de-Brahminization should also mean annihilating these cultures, these rituals, and so on and so forth. So just to repeat, thinking in a Brahminical manner would be more appropriate a phrase.
I just have a very quick question, if I may. So,
can I have a question?
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry, who's this? D, could you please name yourself as well?
Sir, can I have a question?
Sure, please go ahead, but please let us have your name first.
Sir, Deepankar.
Deepankar, please go ahead, Deepankar. Yeah.
Sir, don't you think that the grip of discrimination has been successful to secure position in divine level also, not just in human dimension? Like you said before, Durga is seen as the white one and Asur is seen as the black one. So we are unconsciously subscribing the idea that white are the only ones who are associated with the notion of justice, and the blacks are the evil ones.
Yeah, I mean, although not that straightforward, although there is an existing discourse. That's a good question. There is an existing discourse of the Brahmins being coming from the same stock as the Europeans and so on and so forth, and Adivasis and Dalits, outcasts, lower caste, they are from like native people, dark skinned, and so on and so forth. I think this theory has been rejected by many people already. Ambedkar, even Vivekananda rejected this. So what I'm saying is that, but of course, I think there is a hierarchy. There is, even at the divine level. I mean, Shudras were born out of the like the legs, thighs of the not thighs, feet of the feet of Brahma, and this entire anatomy. But where were the Dalits born from? Nothing is mentioned. So what I'm trying to say is that even within the divine anatomy, there is a hierarchy. Although I think feet are more important than sometimes, but never mind. But definitely, I mean, within the mythology of the Varna system, within the text of Manusmriti, in fact, there is a brilliant poem by Meena Kandasamy called "Raped Nation," which is based on the rape in Hathras, Monisha Balmiki, the case of Monisha Balmiki, and there she mentions that the fact that Dalit women are raped, almost every day, it is because Manu gave the Brahmin and the upper caste men the mandate, the license to rape. What I'm trying to say is that there is a divine justification, as you said, to continue atrocities. Babasaheb Ambedkar in Annihilation of Caste says, Hindus believe in caste not because they want to believe in caste, but because their religion asks them to believe in caste. It sanctions caste. So the entire discourse of the divine, of religion that you are referring to, I think is very important in conceptualizing not only the Brahminical supremacy, but also the persistence of caste atrocities. Yeah, thank you.
So let me have a very quick question. I mean, it's coming out of one of the threads that you opened up, Mahitosh. I was just thinking about that formulation of subject formation itself as Brahminical, because it's the whole cultural discourse itself is Brahminical. I'm just wondering, in terms of the unconscious, when we think of a split subject, an unconscious that might split the subjective unity as well, how could we think of a cut in that subject, a split in the Brahminical subject? And is there a way of thinking about, annihilation of caste in that direction, where we are talking about splitting the Brahminical subject, the unified Brahminical subject, if it were like that? And of course, this is a little bit going in the same direction as I was saying. I've always kind of wondered about whether this direction of identification without a solidification of one particular identity could be an anti-casteist trajectory in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Because, of course, as we know it, you have to go against the logic of mastery as well, right?
That's a good question. And I mean, both the remarks and the question. I think one of the split, of course, one could think about the split at the point of castration, as Lacan would say, via Freud, that there is the replacement of some desire of the mother and so on and so forth, and the embracing of the name of the father. And in this case, the name of the father, the law, the logic, and the language is fundamentally structured by Brahminism. So what I'm trying to say is this, that the split happens when you always already are socialized in terms of embracing the Brahminical discourse. But I think the more important point remains, the more shall I say, unsettling point is the discovery later on, when the subject realizes that even though he is Brahminized, even though he is Brahminical, he is not considered to be equal to the Brahmins, equal to the upper castes. And that is the point when a lot of psychopathological symptoms can occur, including what at one point Fano calls abandonment neurosis, alienation. You might stop talking to people, because you realize, at one point Bhava says, white but not quite. You are Brahminical, but not really a Brahmin, not really an upper caste. And this happened at multiple occasions. I have examples, but I don't have time to give them. Examples which include instances where the actual trauma of the subject doesn't take place, one could say, via Fano as well, at the so-called castration that socializes one through Brahminization. But it actually takes place this encounter or rejection from the Brahminical system, which you have already internalized. So you know that you think like a Brahmin, or you think in a Brahminical manner, that you are a Brahminic subject, but still you are not accepted within the Brahminical system as one of them. So it is at that point when, like Fano says, that the trauma of the black person emerges when there is an encounter with the white world. So as long as the person is in the African context, or even in the purely, let's say, the community where everybody is black, or a community where everybody is Dalit, you don't have that encounter, you don't have the trauma. You come out of that community, you come, let's say, to a city space which is dominated by the Brahmins, and you realize that you are looked down upon, you are looked at in a different manner. And so therefore the encounter with this, so there is, one could say, there is a kind of, one has to unlearn one's Brahminical subjectivity.
This is the Eklavya moment, I think.
Yeah. So you realize that, yeah, I am oh my God, I have done everything. I have believed in this. I have worshipped these heroes of my life, and now they are saying that I'm not Brahminical enough. They're saying that you are not one of us. I'll give you one example. Just let me allow. There is this writer, Rajendranath Sarkar. Rajendranath Sarkar is a Poundras thinker who wrote a brilliant autobiography called Jivan Katha. He mentions one point when he was in Kolkata, and he joined Gandhiji's non-cooperation movement, and then they went out on a march, and they came back. After the procession ended, they came back, and then the teacher, the principal of the college, was celebrating that and also encouraging all the students. Oh my God, you really participated in this freedom movement, congratulations and all that. And then he got to know about Rajendranath, and immediately he said, you are Rajendranath, you are Rajendranath Sarkar. And then the moment, the reaction Rajendranath tells us that immediately he felt that he could be part of the freedom movement up to the point when the principal didn't know that he was a Dalit, or didn't realize that he was a Dalit. The moment he realizes that he's a Dalit, then of course he is abandoned. Like, he goes and talks to other people. So this is subtle moments of encounter generate certain neurotic symptoms, even abandonment neurosis, as Fano calls it. And so the trauma doesn't end, as it were, or doesn't begin just at the moment of castration. But I think it also resumes, or a new, fresh amount of kind of trauma happens when there is an encounter between the Dalit and the Brahminical world. When the Dalit is thinks in a Brahminical way, but not accepted as one of them. Sorry, that was just a random response to what you said.
That was a very specific response. I think that was very interesting. So I think we've more or less run out of time, but I did want to sort of at least, perhaps highlight one of the things that really struck me in this talk was the way, Mahitosh, you were talking about the complication of the racist imaginary in terms of the amorphous nature of an answer one would have to that question, what does the Dalit look like? It's not a straightforward answer, and how that amorphousness in a way brings us back to an archetype in the collective unconscious. And I was also thinking whether we could think of the possibility of not of a collective unconscious, of course, in the Lacanian orientation, but some sort of a collective subjectivity where the symptom of caste, in a very ironic way, produces a collective. I mean, like a chain in the sort of final sort of thoughts on the generalized Borromean that Lacan had. And if we go back to the Logical Time essay, there's that enigmatic question he asks about the collective subject, which his work never quite directly responds to. But I'm just thinking off the cuff here, whether the problem of casteism could also be seen in terms of that kind of a virological connector, like a viral connector that creates a certain collective, and a collective of a casteist society, let's say. That's what I'm thinking of here at this point.
That's a very good way to put it. I
just
think
a speculation. It's just a speculation. But I think it was again very interesting the way we're talking about symptomatic and asymptomatic casteism. And it also made me think about the connections between metaphor and symptom in Lacan, where there is a consonance again, right? A metaphor is a point of concentration, and a symptom and metaphor would go hand in hand in Lacan's reading. So even in that way, many of the casteist metaphors are symptomatic, quite literally, in that sense, as you showed us, right, in terms of your examples. And that, I think, again, opened up. And also this very interesting question of affect, the intersubjectivity, the way of treating the other, how the problem of caste is not necessarily a rational question. It's not a question of rationality, as at one point, I think, if I understood you correctly, you indicated that we cannot think of this just in terms of rationalization. I might rationalize everything, and yet I might be a casteist at various levels. So I think that again also opens up a certain psychoanalytic possibility of reading caste as something beyond the rational, which is not to say it's irrational, of course, but something that is not necessarily foldable within a certain linear logic of rationality or rationalism, possibly. There, I can see there are certain comments here, but these are responses to other. I mean, there's a sort of dialogue happening in the chat box, so let us not go into that. But let me take one last question from Preeti Gandha. Preeti Gandha says, you spoke about the invisibilization of caste, Dalit, but I think that there is also a hyper-visibilization of Dalit, which increases atrocities. Just wanted to know your opinion on this. So if we could have this as the last question, please.
Okay, that's an interesting observation, a hyper-visibilization as opposed to invisible. I think the very event of hyper-visibilization happens because there is a tremendous amount of invisibilization. So only a few Dalits stand out, as it were. And therefore they have to be they have to be either appropriated, or they have to co-opted, or they have to be attacked, targeted. So the reason, if you are asking me, like, could you repeat the question? I mean, does it want an answer to?
Yeah. So she's asking if this hyper visibilization is also something that increases the atrocities.
Well, it's a question that I need to think before I can answer. Think about.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, what I meant was that if you see a lot of online discourse in the past few years has experienced a lot of Dalit organizations, a lot of Dalit activists, a lot of Dalit artists, and a lot of Dalit authors coming out and saying a lot of things that sort of highlight Dalit culture, not to put anything down, but there's a lot of visible Dalit culture that is there in online spaces now. And you only have to look at like the top comments to see, the kind of hatred that is spewed in these comments as well. So I was just wondering, when you talk about invisibilization of caste or the Dalit, how do you conceive of this paradox? Because there is a paradox, there is invisibilization, and there is also, in the recent few years, there is also a hyper visibilization. I'm just wondering, like, it's just out of curiosity, how do you conceive of this in terms of atrocities? Like, just my curiosity.
No, I think that's yeah, I got you. That's a good question. I mean, it's important to think about invisibilization and hyper visibilization. Whether there is a paradox is something I'm not very, but I would give you of course I would it's fine to think on that line. But I think even if you think about Dalit activists, there is, I think, the kind of Dalit population we have, like we have over 300 million Dalit population, including in India and in the Indian diaspora. I think some people, I would repeat what I already said, that some people are hyper visible, if you could say, because the bulk of the Dalit population is totally invisible. That is so. I don't think it is a paradox. I think it is something that leads one to another. It is more like complementary, shall I say? I don't know, where because of hyper invisibility, there is hyper because of invisibility or invisibilization, there is hypervisibilization. Once again, when you say hypervisibilization, it's very important that you mention social media. Hypervisibilization, think about, I don't know, like if you know about a state like West Bengal, there is no visibilization of a Dalit in West Bengal as such. I mean, not even in the mainstream media, newsroom and so on, entertainment industry, sports, you don't have anybody. You don't have anybody worth talking about or anybody who represents. We have a Dalit president. The Dalit president is, of course, not serving the interests of the Dalits, like more like Brahminized subject. I'm very sorry to make this political remark here, but there is something called political unconscious as well. But what I'm saying is this, that the reason of hypervisibility, I mean, of course, Dalits, whether they're invisible or hypervisible, they would be suffering atrocities whenever they try to encroach into certain zones. So if you remain within your limits, no atrocity perhaps will happen. But and people who you are describing as hyper visible, I think those people have crossed all limits. So it is only given the anger of the Brahminical society, they will be on the receiving end of, like Meena Kandasamy. She's not a Dalit, but she received death threats. Her children were like threatened to be killed and kidnapped and killed. Everything happened, and it happens because more she talks about the problem of caste and gender, the more. So I think it creates another kinds of psychological problem. You get not only threats, but also you are always under the fear of persecution. That you will be, if they get you out there, they might kill you, they might lynch you, and so on and so forth. So I think it is important. I'm just thinking aloud in terms of saying that it would be interesting to read hypervisibilization in conjunction, as opposed to in conjunction with invisibilization, and the possibility that hypervisibilization happens because of invisibilization. And the other thing is that hypervisibilization is all the more, I would agree with you on that, hypervisibilization is all the more the reason, as it were, to invite attacks on oneself, because you are doing something that nobody wants you to do. These are the brave people we're talking about, activists, the bravest, and they have sacrificed a lot for the community. They are committed to the cause, and I that much I can say about them. But that's a good question. I think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahitosh, for your time. I think we've run out of time, and but let me congratulate everyone for this wonderful conversation at the end as well. It's not that we always have a very vibrant Q&A, but this one was literally a very vibrant Q&A with so many questions. Thank you, Parul, for recording. Thank you, Swati, for helping me organize this. And again, thank you, Mahitosh. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.